In this video, I'm going to describe the use of binding expressions to pass data from one object to another in a Flex application at runtime. A binding expression is a way of creating a relationship between two objects, where the value of a property of a first object, known as the source property, is broadcast to a destination. The destination is a property of another object that wants to receive that value and have it be updated whenever the value changes at runtime. There are two syntax styles that you can use to create a binding relationship. There's a shorthand version that you use inside an MXML attribute declaration, and a longhand version that uses the MX binding tag to create the relationship. I'll show you both syntax styles, and you can choose whichever one you like. To demonstrate a simple binding relationship, I'm going to create two controls. I'll start off with a text input control. By the way, if you're following along in these exercises, I'm putting this code into a file called bindingexpressions.mxml in the Chapter 03 Begin project. I'll put in the text input control and assign an ID. This text input control's text property will be the source for the binding expression, and whichever control serves as the source always must have an ID so that you can uniquely identify the object and refer to it in the binding expression. I'll assign the ID as my input. Now I'll add a label control. The label control's text property will be the destination for the binding expression. When you use shorthand binding syntax, as I'm going to do here, the destination control does not need a unique identifier. I simply put in the text property, and then I'll put in a binding expression. The shorthand syntax of a binding expression consists of a pair of braces wrapped around an ActionScript expression that refers to the value you want to listen for. The expression here will be myInput.text. I'll complete the tag and then save and run the application. When the application appears in the browser, I'll click into the text input control and start typing. Notice that as I type, the label control picks up the new value of the text property of the text input control and displays its new value upon every keystroke. This is because the text property of the text input control is a bindable value, and this text property automatically executes its bindings whenever the user types in a new value on every keystroke. Let's go back to the code and explain it a little bit more thoroughly. The relationship between the text input and the label control is the relationship of a broadcaster and a listener. The text input control broadcasts changes each time its text property is changed, and the label control is listening for those changes and using them in its text property. You can also create the same relationship using the MX binding tag. Using source view, I'm going to create two more controls. The second text input control will have an ID of myInput2, and then the second label control will have an ID. When you set up a binding relationship using the MX binding tag, both the source and the destination controls need IDs, because you'll be referring to both of them in the MX binding attributes. So I'll put in an ID for this label of myLabel2. Now I'll create a binding relationship. The MX binding tag is a compiler tag. It doesn't actually represent a class per se. Instead, it's interpreted in the background into ActionScript code during the compilation process. These sorts of binding tags are commonly placed below the application start tag, but above any visual controls. Technically, it doesn't really matter where they're placed, though. I'll add in an MX binding tag, and I'll set the source and the destination. The source will look like this: myInput2.text, and the destination will look very similar. It'll be the control's ID and its property where I want the value to flow to, myLabel2.text. So that's what an MX binding tag looks like. I'll run the application. I'll click into the second text input control and type some text. And once again, you see the effect of the binding, that each time the user changes the text input control's text property by typing another keystroke, the binding is executed, and the label that's listening for the value receives the value and displays it. Now, why would you use the MX binding tag instead of the shorthand version? Well, as long as you're dealing exclusively with MXML declarations of objects, the MX binding tag is really overly verbose. It does what you want it to do, but it obviously takes a lot more code to do it. But the MX binding tag is very important where you want to bind to variables or other values that are not declared in MXML. Let's take an example of a variable. I'm going to put in an MX script section, and then within the MX script section, I'm going to declare a variable named myString, data typed as a string value. And I'm also going to mark it as bindable. You mark variables as being bindable by adding something called the bindable metadata tag right before the variable declaration. In ActionScript 3, your own variables are not bindable. That is, they aren't capable of automatically broadcasting changes when their values update, unless you mark them explicitly. So you put in the bindable metadata tag right before the variable declaration. Now, to pass a value into this variable, you can use the MX binding tag like this. I'm going to change the destination of this binding to myString. And this means that as the user types the value into the text input control, the value will be automatically passed over to the myString variable. Then I'll take the label control and I'll add in a text property and I'll bind to the value of myString. We're now getting a 3-level binding relationship. The user types into the text input control. That value is passed to the myString variable through the MX binding tags instructions, and then the value is passed over to the label control as a result of the binding expression in its text property. I'll save and run the application one more time. I'll click into the second text input control and type a value, and once again you can see the effect. As the user types into the text input control, the value is reflected in the label control. You can use bindings in a lot of different ways, not just for text values, but also to handle the results of interactions with visual controls, such as sliders and scroll bars. You can set up these relationships using either the simple shorthand syntax, wrapping ActionScript expressions inside braces, or you can set them up using the more explicit MX binding tag. The MX binding tag is typically used in circumstances where you want to pass a value to an object that's been declared in ActionScript rather than in MXML. But in many circumstances, you have the choice of the style of syntax that you prefer.